Teenage girls using social media more likely to be depressed than boys. A new study calls for caution. What's the connection and why? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. The extent to which social media has embedded itself into the daily lives of people cannot be understated. A UK study has looked specifically at how teenagers are affected, the differences between how they project themselves online and the unattainable images and fantasies they are bombarded with. Researchers at University College London studied almost 11,000 14-year-olds. They say teenage girls are twice as likely to show depressive symptoms as boys. But twice as many girls as boys use social media for more than 3 hours a day. The study found that can lead to mood swings, a drop in confidence and poor sleeping habits. This isn't the first study to link social media use with depression. In a 2017 survey, the UK's Royal Society for Public Health found signs of anxiety and what was dubbed FOMO, or fear of missing out, by young people if they weren't on the web. And in the United States, the University of Pittsburgh suggested too much social media use can cause social isolation that could lead to behavioural symptomatic of an addiction. Now, we should say all these studies showed a connection between social media and depression, but not necessarily a cause. Well, let's bring our guests into the show now. Joining us from London, we have Dennis Ougrin, a clinical senior lecturer at King's College in London. In Oxford, Amy Orben, psychological researcher at the University of Oxford. Amy investigates the effects of social media and other technologies. And in London as well, Stella Branthonne Foster, a student who's a former patient of Dennis. Welcome to you all. If I could start with Dennis. So this study talks about correlation, but does that mean causality necessarily? In other words, it was because of their exposure to social media that they developed signs of depression?
No, it doesn't. So one has to say that correlation or association is very different from causality. And causality is a difficult thing to establish. And this kind of study design does not lend itself to it. Having said this, one has to say that there are elements of this study which are really important and quite novel. So one of them is that there is the so-called dose-response relationship, which means that we can very clearly see that the greater the number of hours of social media use, the greater the number of and severity of depressive symptoms.
So it means there is a link, in other words, even if we don't know that it's necessarily a cause, right? Is that where we're going, Dennis, just to break this down in layman's terms?
Yes, it's an association. So what it means is that young people who are depressed or unhappy are more likely to use social media. But the direction of the cause and effect is not established. So we don't know for sure whether the young people who are depressed already are more likely to use social media or the other way around.
Right, right.
Now, having said this, I have to say that over time, I used to always be of the view that social media is an accelerator, and it accelerates everything. It accelerates good things and bad things. But I have to say that over time, as we have more and more of these association or correlation studies, they all seem to point in one direction, i.e. that excessive, heavy social media is definitely linked, correlated with depression. But it makes me think that there may be more to it than that. And so I really think that one has to begin thinking about some sort of interventions at the public health level, because we may be at the start of something that could be quite damaging to young people in the same way that we were correlating cigarette smoking and lung cancer long before causality was
Okay, Dennis,
established.
but let me jump in and stop you there, because we will, you're absolutely right, we need to talk about policy implications of this. But before we get into that, I want to pick apart some more points from this study and bring Amy's perspective into it. Why do you think, Amy, are girls who use social media showing a higher correlation or link with depression than boys?
I think that finding that girls have a high correlation between their mental health and their social media use is quite consistent throughout the literature. I want to go back to what Dennis said, in that what we are looking at here are correlations. And while we find these small negative correlations throughout our work with various of these data sets that have now been analyzed, what we do find is that these correlations are extremely, extremely small. So even though they're significant, it's quite easy to get this sort of statistical significance in these data sets because they're extremely large. So you have the real power to find very, very small effects. But with this power comes a kind of question to us as scientists as to whether are these relations actually of importance. And from the studies in 2017 that you also mentioned, we know that, yes, while girls are more affected by social media use than boys, still 99.6% of their mental health can't be predicted by us knowing how much social media they use. That means that only 1% of their well-being is predicted by their social media use, which again makes us really question, are we really focusing our attention on the right thing by discussing so much about social media damaging mental health, once we know that other things that affect a child's life have a much higher importance in the amount of predictive value they add. So if I know how much a child sleeps, how well a child eats, or how caring their parents are, I can predict a lot more about how good it will be feeling.
So are you saying, Amy, we could actually be getting distracted by looking at studies like this than focusing on what probably are the real causes of depression and mental health issues?
I think this debate is drowning out really complicated and complex conversations that we do need to have. So because there are correlations, we don't know what the causal relationship is. Recent research in the US found that disadvantaged children use technology up to 2 to 3 hours more per day. We also know that disadvantaged children feel worse. So we're naturally going to find negative correlations between technologies and well-being throughout the data sets that we analyze. I'm not surprised about that. What I want to ask as a scientist is, should we be investing so much money into policy change or interventions? Because such large steps and such money spent really needs a large amount of evidence to back it up. And personally, I think that large amount of evidence does not yet exist in the current research literature.
That's a really interesting point, and I want to keep it going between both of you as scientists and academics. But before we do that, I'd like to bring in, shall we say, the user perspective in all of this. And Stella, you have been a patient. You've had challenges with depression. Tell us from, shall we say, a user's perspective, what role can or does social media or exposure to social media have on where a young person is at mentally?
I think it really depends, and I think it depends on how you use social media. So for myself, it's been both beneficial and harmful, and that's definitely depended on the platforms I've been using and the people I've been interacting with. So I've met lots of friends through social media. I've made some really good friendships, which has really helped over the years. But equally, I picked up lots of sort of bad ideas, shall we say, from social media. And if I've surrounded myself with people who've been equally sort of unwell, then that's definitely been more harmful than anything at certain points, I guess.
Do you see a pattern, though, when you look at exposure, particularly for young ladies, shall we say, girls, adolescents, teenagers? Do you see a pattern in the way that perhaps the types of social media they're exposed to or people that they associate with?
I'm not sure about other people, and I can only really talk about myself, but definitely for myself, when I've been in a bad place mentally, I've probably spent more time on social media, which means I've been sort of surrounded with the good and the bad aspects. But if you're not in a very good place, then it's quite easy to latch on to the more harmful aspects of social media. So surrounding with other people who perhaps are in an even worse place than you or are just as bad a place. I think, but even sort of stepping away from that and just general social media use, I've definitely found that if I'm just scrolling through Facebook and, you know, everything is fine and I'm just laying in bed and I'm just woken up in the morning, it's really easy. I find it really easy to look at what other people are doing and compare myself to them. So I think, oh, look how well this person's doing in their life, or look at all this cool stuff they're getting up to, and I'm doing, like, I'm laying in bed and doing absolutely nothing with my life. And I think it's really easy, even if you sort of take the mental health specific stuff away, I think it's still really easy just day to day to get really sucked into social media. That's not to say there's not really good bits in social media. It's not to say that it can be really useful. There are definitely platforms that have been incredibly beneficial to me and my mental health generally. But I do think that, as I said, it depends how you're using social media. And sometimes it's really hard to see when you're in the midst of it how you're using social media and to see that actually it's negative. I think that's something you can only really see when you take a step back and you sort of have a little think about it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And that's an interesting point, which I want to take back to Amy and perhaps, I don't want to say challenge your thinking there, but, you know, when you said earlier that there may be other factors about, you know, how well a child may be eating or an adolescent eating or sleeping and so on. Is there a difference here when we talk about social media? Because it does, as Stella pointed out, seem like it sucks people in a way that, you know, your regular food or other factors don't necessarily do. This becomes your whole life. You exist in a make-believe world that you can't get out of mentally.
I think Stella made two really important points. So the first is this diversity, that social media, and if we talk about screen time, is incredibly diverse. Looking at photos on Instagram will naturally have different effects than scrolling through your newsfeed or chatting to friends or Skyping grandparents. And so this, again, makes it really hard for us to figure out what is actually happening, because while one might be very beneficial, another might be harmful. I'm not going to go against that, but I think what is really important for us is to recognize this diversity, and that often we're lumping things together when we're comparing apples to oranges. And also, what Stella's recognizing is that there are different ways in which this relationship between mental health and social media use can take place. So on the one hand, you might experience some changes after using social media, but as she mentioned, it also, some certain feelings might drive you to use more social media as well. So we could be looking at cycles, and at the moment, the mathematical models that we use to look at these relationships, we can't tear apart and dissociate these different, maybe feeling more down leading to more social media use, or more social media use leading to feeling down. And so we see this immense complexity, which makes this feel really exciting to work in as well.
Let me take that point back to Dennis, the idea that on some level, this kind of research can be masking a lot of factors and making us, you know, jump to a lot of assumptions, and it could be a bit distractive rather than helpful. What do you think?
Oh, we certainly should not jump into conclusions prematurely. And I totally agree that depression is a multifactorial disorder. And of course, one should not assume that social media use is the only cause or even a major cause of depression. It's a much more complex disorder than that. Now, having said all this, and having also recognized Stella's point that social media use could be both beneficial and harmful to young people, I have to say that over time, as we have more and more evidence, more and more studies that are correlational, they are not establishing causality, but just the volume of these studies and also the dose-response relationships that they see, and also these differences between boys and girls, which are really quite interesting, And also, another important point here is that earlier this year, we had a very large survey of child mental health in the UK, which replicated the findings of about 15 years ago. And what it found was that the vast majority of disorders that young people have not increased. So things like autism, ADHD, OCD and things of that nature really have not changed at all. But what has increased very, very substantially was emotional disorders like anxiety and depression in older girls, in older teenage girls. And also self-harm increased very substantially in older girls too. And that is not an artifact, it's a real thing. It's something that is something that actually rarely happens, that you can actually see in the same population.
Do the studies say that's
increase.
particularly, and do they pin it to use of the internet or social media, Dennis?
No.
Again, it's more of an association, right?
So the association is there, but my point is that the prevalence, the number of children with emotional disorders has increased in our population very substantially, especially the older girls. And that's something that we have not seen before. And of course, one might hypothesize in many different ways, well, why is that? But one thing that occurred at the same time is, of course, the exponential increase in social media use and the internet use in general. Now, I think everybody will agree here that social media are actually addictive. There is plenty of evidence to say that. And they are designed to be addictive as well.
All right.
But they're not the only, of course, addictive thing.
Let me take that point back to Stella. Do you agree with that? Do you feel as a young person, Stella, social media sometimes is designed to target young people in a very addictive manner?
Yeah, definitely. If I think about my social media use now, and if I was to think about getting rid of all of my social media, I could probably do it, but I probably wouldn't be happy doing it, and I would probably struggle. So yeah, I'd say it is addictive to an extent.
What do you think who do you think should perhaps monitor that or regulate that, Stella? Would you be happy with the suggestions in this study, for example, that say the industry should step in, or should it be families, or how do you see? How would you take to someone else telling you what you should do and be exposed to?
So I would be hesitant for that to happen. I've had people talk to me about my social media use, not in recent years, but when I was younger, so when I was in my early teens and quite unwell. And I just found it really offensive. I didn't really take it on board at all. And if anything, it sort of rubbed me up the wrong way. And I was like, well, I'm just not going to talk to you about my social media use then if you're just going to tell me to stop. So I don't think that it should be the role of industry or parents or anyone to
Not even parents?
It's really difficult because, I mean, to an extent, yeah, I think having the conversation is important. So I definitely think that people should be having the conversation, whether that's, you know, school staff, parents, mental health professionals, whoever it is, youth workers, the conversation should be had. So how are you using your social media? Is it helping you, you know, talking about the relationships that you're building with people on social media? I think that should definitely happen. Whether or not someone should step in and try and take control of that, I think that's a different question. It's about supporting and empowering young people to use it in ways that's, you know, more constructive, as opposed to just saying you can't use it or you can't use it like that. Just, you know, delete your Instagram or something. If that makes sense, I think it has to be collaborative as opposed to done to.
All right, let me take those sentiments to Amy and say, Amy, with your position being that perhaps we're, you know, in studies like this, we run the risk of maybe making too many premature conclusions. Do you feel that the conversation about whether there needs to be some regulation of adolescent exposure to social media is also very premature?
I think the word regulation, just like the word addiction, which is also still heavily debated in the research community.
So you're not sure there is an addiction, Amy, is what you're saying?
Well, I just wanted to note that The social media addiction has not yet been recognized as a formal addiction. We often see addiction as something incredibly severe. Oftentimes molecules that go into your bloodstream that cause physical dependence. And yes, I do think that we don't yet have that level of evidence, and that screens do not physically affect a person. And this is an ongoing debate that I think could take up a whole nother program. But it does show that we need to be careful. Go ahead.
I say you're probably right, but let's take a stab at it anyway, shall we?
Yeah, well, I wanted to talk a bit about regulation because regulation can actually happen at all different levels. I think it is premature to think about regulation at the very high level of policy, of spending a lot of money into campaigns and interventions, because we've seen in other countries that those can be very ineffective, because if you limit adolescents or children's use of something, they can often find ways around that. And it often goes over the top of what they actually want from their lives. And naturally, our world is constantly changing. But I do see that today a report came out from the Society for Pediatrics, and they really emphasize this need to really talk and have conversations in families about technology use and start that conversation very early. Setting some boundaries, keeping to those boundaries, and making those boundaries dependent on the child, their use, and the context. And that sort of smaller scale regulation, I think, can be the way forward because it allows us to be flexible. We were talking about this diversity of social media. We haven't talked yet about the diversity of children and their situations. And so taking it to the level of the family might be the best way forward in the current situation.
All right, Dennis, you got us thinking about interventions at the beginning of the show. Let me come back to you for your thoughts, given what Amy said. A rather more cautious note from Amy in thinking about regulation. What sort of interventions do you think are appropriate then?
Look, I just wanted to respond to Amy. And of course, I mean, I agree with her in the sense that we do need a lot more research. There is no doubt about this. But there are a few important things within this study and other studies of that kind that really need to be highlighted. So one of them is, of course, the association, which we have been talking about. The other important part of this study was that the researchers looked at mechanisms. So how is this association between heavy social media use and depressive symptoms, how could it be explained? What is the mechanism? It's called the mediator in science. And what they have found that one of the strongest mechanisms or mediators of this relationship was the lack of sleep. And I really want to emphasize this because this is not the first study that have found that what explains the link between heavy social media and poor mental health is the impact of social media on sleep. I think Amy will not dispute that sleep is important in our mental health, in particular in emotional well-being.
I don't think she does.
So
she's smiling, so that's a good sign. I think she agrees with that.
Yeah, I can't see her. I'm sure she is smiling because that has been conclusively proven. And so, and of course, the other important part, another important mechanism that has been shown by this study and similar studies is that online harassment could be another mechanism that explains this link. And so we do need more research, but we also need to acknowledge that we have enough research to say that social media needs to be taken very carefully and thought through very carefully in terms of what it is that we allow our children, who sometimes could be very young, when they start using social media, to do. And the second thing to say is that social media is not the only addictive thing on the internet. Now, I'm a clinician. I see patients a lot. And yesterday I saw a patient, and that patient is very similar to a great number of patients that we see, who really spends many, many hours on the computer and really does not leave home at all and does not do anything else. And it's something that is a relatively recent phenomenon. I don't remember.
You could understand that would be worrying, right?
Of young people, in the past.
Right, right. Well, I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there. It's been a really fascinating discussion, though. I'd like to thank all of our guests, Dennis Ougrin, Amy Orben, and Stella Branthonne Foster. Thank you all. Thank you too for watching. You can see the show again anytime you want by visiting our website. That's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, just head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zeidan, and the whole team here, it's goodbye for now.